to Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan. Thank you, NEK-TV, for having us on the air. We have our esteemed featured guest today. We have the Vermont State Deputy Auditor, Tim Ashe. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
How are you?
Feeling good.
I'm very
Happy to be
excited
here.
about this. Thank you. It's a little snowy out there, and I'm really glad that you could join us. So we're going to talk today about the auditor's office, your role. But before we get into that, you come with a fertile background in politics, and you've been doing service for the state of Vermont for years. Could you kind of fill the listeners in on your background and then how you ended up becoming the deputy auditor?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I came to the role, as you say, with a kind of a long history in public service. I had been in the state Senate for about 12 years and had a range of responsibilities in my time there, beginning as sort of the newest face in the Senate back in 2009. And then culminating in being the pro tem, which is kind of like the Speaker of the House equivalent in the Senate. Before that, I had served on the Burlington City Council, so I had municipal experience that I brought to the Senate, which has been helpful both in that role and then in my current role. And I was also an affordable housing developer for about a decade. And Cathedral Square is an organization primarily in northwestern Vermont that serves low-income seniors and people with disabilities. Because we were the only organization really focused on that population, we were often consulting with nonprofit housing organizations throughout the state, like Gilman Housing Trust, now Rural Edge up in your neck of the woods. So my role there was to help develop the new properties, which was a very satisfying job because, as you can imagine, the housing crunch has gotten worse or more acute today, but even in the time that I was at Cathedral Square, especially for seniors without money resources, it was in short supply. So every unit we created was really addressing a very urgent need, and we produced about 400 in the time that I was there. So when I finished up in the Senate, I was excited when Doug Hoffer, who's the state auditor, had reached out to me to see if I might be interested in joining as his deputy. His deputy before me was Andrew Stein. Andrew, wonderful guy, very smart and capable, moved over to the tax department to take on the role of COO to help their team manage all the initiatives that they have going. And so I slid into this role as a deputy state auditor in April of 2021 and have been off and running since.
Are you enjoying it? I know you have to say yes, but it's different, right? I mean, I didn't know that about the housing part of your career, and thank you for that. So it's an entirely different avenue to go into auditing and to go behind the scenes. So are you finding it somewhat a learning experience continually, or are you having fun following the money?
Well, it is a very different experience from previous public roles I've had. In the past, I've had a vote, and that vote allows you to make something happen or possibly make something not happen. In this role, we have a very different function, which is to both maintain integrity across state government, both in terms of how the money is spent, but also how programs are performing. And then also to try to persuade or cajole or encourage the best practices of various state agencies and sometimes the legislature. So it really is a different set of skills you have to hone to do a good job in the state auditor's office. I have enjoyed seeing it from a different perspective. And also in our role, we're seeing the whole of state government. Certainly on the financial front. And then we're able to dive extremely deeply into particular programs. So whereas most people observe state agencies like the Agency of Transportation from sort of a 30,000 foot view, we're able to say, we're going to come in and look at how they're managing paving projects, and then look at every gory detail to determine whether they're delivering the best value for taxpayers' money. So in some ways, you get a richer lens into how state government is working.
And a very important one. And you also need to go in there with some skepticism, and you need to be independent.
Yes.
Which is a difficult task, because we all have our own passions, we all have our own desires, but that training and staying independent is what keeps it healthy. And so now let's talk a little bit about the mission of the State Auditor's Office, and then let's look at the different types of audits that you actually do. So do you want to run with that?
I'm happy to, but before we do, sure. just a quick word. You mentioned the independence piece, which is one of the most critical things that our office has to maintain. Sometimes I think people have very little knowledge about what the State Auditor's Office does. They think that oftentimes if we call, they think we're going to look at their tax forms or something, and that's not what the office does. That's what the tax department does. But we are the office that can be counted on to come in without any bias when we're looking at whether a program is functioning the way it's supposed to. And the auditors who work for us are bound by a very, very rigid and well-documented set of professional standards that require them to be free from any personal connection to what's being audited, any known biases that they may bring to the table, so that when they produce an audit report from our office, it literally is just the facts. People can disagree about what to do with those facts, but they can't disagree with the facts that we present. And that independence is really critical, that we not only maintain it, but promote the fact that we are operating with that type of independence. We are the unique piece of state government in that we do not take direction, generally speaking, from the governor. We do not take direction generally from the judicial branch or the legislature. We are the island of accountability that is kind of covering and looking at all of those three branches of government to make sure that things are going the way they're supposed to.
And they say judges have no friends.
Right. Yeah, when we call and say, "Hey, it's Tim from the auditor's office," it's rare that people's first reaction is, "I've been waiting for you to call." This is the highlight of
right, but it's exciting. I'm glad to hear that, because independence is the key to auditing. Yeah. I mean, and without that, then it's a joke. And so you're absolutely right. It's a fact-finding mission, but it's tested fact-finding. Right. And so you actually work for using the rules of GAGAS. I mean, we keep adding all these ASs, whether it's GAS, GAP, GAS, right? And that is actually the Office of Accountability, the Government Accountability, the Yellow Book. And you have CPAs who work within your office, so they also have licensing regulations. So this is a serious department.
Yeah, and we're a bit smaller than some states too. We're 16 people total. So this is not a vast bureaucracy charged with holding government accountable. It is a lean operation. We perform. This partly gets to your question. We perform performance audits, and I'll explain what that is in a second. But we contract with a firm named Clifton Larson Allen, CLA, to do two things that are required by law of our office. One is the annual comprehensive financial report. That's the state's financial audit. That's what basically makes sure that all the money has been accounted for properly. It identifies various financial and internal control risks if they're found, and that gets reported and is completed by December 31st each year. The second sort of big picture audit report that is produced is the so-called single audit. So as your listeners will know, the state receives a tremendous amount of federal money, whether it's for education, transportation, healthcare, programs like Medicaid. And every state is required to do an audit of how the state is using those federal funds. Is it spending the money on eligible uses? And is it following all the program rules? So take Medicaid as an example. Is the money going for legitimate healthcare expenses? And is the money going to people who are actually eligible to be in the Medicaid program? So both, is the money being spent on something that's an eligible use? And then is the program actually being managed well? So those are the two big financial elements that are contracted with this firm. And we bid that out every number of years to make sure that there's integrity in that bidding process and that we're getting a good deal for taxpayers.
So just for a little bit of clarification for our listeners, the state single audit that you do it on the state side, correct? You do not go into the municipalities but you
Correct.
do direct me, but municipalities are required if they have, I think it's $750,000 or more, they are required to do their own audits.
That is correct.
But does your department make sure that they do it, or do you have no say whatsoever in that compliance?
That is not one of our statutory duties. That's typically a federal compliance issue. So the federal program that is distributing money that goes to municipalities, they will be checking and doing their own audits to make sure municipalities, if they receive about $750,000 in a given year, that they have performed the single audit.
Right. And I want our listeners to understand that this is the state. Your department comes in and is the auditor of the state.
That's correct.
As opposed to Johnny's little town or this one. This is very important that they understand. This is a big responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, the state budget is a substantial, from the time that you and I were in the legislature, it has grown several $1 billion. So it's now in the ballpark of $9 billion a year. And so that's what our office is looking at. Municipalities, we will sometimes get constituents who say, can you please provide us with this particular town's audit? And that is not our responsibility. That is the town's responsibility under state law. They have to produce annual financial audits and make those available to constituents. But we're not a clearinghouse for that kind of activity, nor are we for school districts, which people are often interested in how schools are spending their money.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I want this particular show, with your expertise out there, I want the people to understand what it is that really goes on in your department and the responsibilities, and there's a lot of work going on. So you're out there, your department is literally charged with going out there and holding the government accountable and doing it through specific evaluations, coming in with a skeptical mindset, frown or not, right? And the key there is then and correct me if I'm mistaken, you're also supposed to identify strategies to help eliminate, waste, fraud, and abuse.
That's right.
But you are not responsible for compliance after the findings or enforcement after the findings.
Right.
You can make suggestions, okay, because that would then lose your independence and take you. So, the department should not be blamed for not enforcing something, because that's the whole division, separation of duties. And so you're out there identifying the issues and giving your recommendations.
That's exactly right. And what most people know our office for, even though the financial audits are absolutely critical, most people would find them rather tedious reading. And we
not on the beach with your local, FASB rules.
Yeah, you're not reading that on your iPhone, at a cafe. But what they primarily would know our office from, and what they see in the news more frequently, is what we call performance audits. Performance audits are when we really are looking at a particular program, whether it has financial implications or programmatic, meaning how is the delivery of services to Vermonters. That's what they really know us for, and it's exactly as you described. We will identify a particular activity of state government. And I'll use maybe a good example would be the Agency of Digital Services.
Okay, great.
Agency of Digital Services is what is responsible for all IT in state government. And it only was created in about 2017 or 18 when Governor Scott was in his first term. The legislature allowed the new formation of this agency. And so it's responsible for everything ranging from at the least end to laptops that go to state employees to the high end $100+ million IT project management. So they have a huge portfolio of activity. So we came in and did an audit of their project management division. It's called the Enterprise Project Management Office, EPMO in state government bureaucratic speak. And what we wanted to understand was they present a document that says we've created a scope of work for this IT project, which is supposed to solve some problem. We believe it's going to cost X millions of dollars and it's going to be done in X number of months. So we went in and tried to track their performance and say, when they've come forward and told legislators and taxpayers how much the projects were going to spend, how long it was going to take, and was it successful, were those things actually true? Did they play out the way that they'd been anticipated? So we don't say, should they have done this project? We don't say we wish the government was more or less involved in healthcare for people. We say, you said it was going to cost $5 million. You said it was going to take 12 months. How'd it go? And then we look at the facts and make a determination.
Excellent. So how do you actually choose what you will do performance audits on? Is it a meeting of the minds in the whole department? Is it a directive from the auditor himself? Is it a sit down? I mean, how do you make that decision? Because you want to keep your independence, so you don't want it to be a political decision. You know, we all have our political parties, is what it is, right? And we all have our hearts, and our mind set on like, I'm going to get them, but you're not. So how do you make that decision?
There's an art and a science to it, I would say. The art is that our office is keeping gentle tabs on everything that we can across state government. So we're following legislative actions to see if new programs are being created. We're watching the rise or fall of the amount of money being spent in particular areas by the state. We're catching wind of issues that might be developing that maybe signal that a program is in a bit of trouble. And as we take in the totality of that information, we're trying to identify opportunities to sort of track key constituent pieces of state government and make sure that we're not exclusively focusing on one policy area to the exclusion of everything else. So that's the art of it. We're trying to be a kind of a collective sponge, take in as much information as possible, and then try to identify what are the areas in state government that if we looked at it, have a high potential to mitigate risk of dollars being misspent, significant dollars being misspent. And then what are the areas where if we go in, we could be mitigating the risk of poor delivery of services that are critical to Vermonters. And I'll give a few examples in a second. Okay. The science part of our decision-making about what audits we're going to do is that in part to avoid it being a purely political decision by the auditor or the auditor's office, we filter all of the potential audits we do through a very methodical process. First, we do what's called a risk assessment. A risk assessment is we say, okay, take an example. We did an audit of the Department of Aging and Independent Living. This is the department that is, among other duties, is charged with making sure that people who live in assisted living and residential care facilities are safe and that the facilities are being run properly for these very vulnerable Vermonters. So we thought this is actually a very critical area. We have an aging population. We have thousands and thousands of people who live in these facilities. We don't know that anyone has really turned their magnifying glass on this program in a long time. So let's think about whether we should do an audit. So our audit team then does sort of an initial fact finding. How many people are really affected by the management of this program? How much risk do we truly believe there is if they're doing a poor job? Will it really be consequential to the health and well-being of these Vermont seniors, or is it sort of marginal? And so after going through that whole fact-finding process and seeing what state law requires of the department and what their rules are about how they're going to conduct their behavior, we score based on a number of criteria whether this is a desirable project for us. And while that isn't a hard and fast number, like if it scores X percent, it's an automatic audit, it gives us a common way of comparing possible deployment of resources in our office. And it's something more like a scientific process to avoid us merely saying, we don't like this commissioner, so we're just going to start auditing that person's department over and over again.
Well, that's very important because in auditors, I'm a forensic auditor. And so you need that risk management. You need to do the materiality test. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a target.
That's right.
It's totally, hey, pay attention. And then after you do some of the performance audits, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would think that the results, the findings, could help also determine what other areas you might want to go to. So it is a collaborative effort.
That's right.
And that's
the example I just gave of the Department of Aging and Independent Living, we wound up going forward with the audit. And what we found, like so many things in state government, we found people working conscientiously because they believed in the mission of their department, but we also found some shortcomings in terms of how they were carrying out their duties. And the single most important one, I think, from most Vermonters' point of view, is that state law requires this particular department to inspect each one of these facilities every year. So our audit team looked and said, show us the evidence that these have been inspected every single year. And it turned out that many of the facilities, in fact, most of the facilities had not been inspected. I mean, some of them were every 2 years, some were every 3, 4, 5 years, which meant that situations that might present themselves that could be life safety hazards or whatever often went uninspected for a very, very long time and in violation of state law. So what we then did at the end of our audit is, as you alluded to before, we make recommendations to the agency about how they can improve their practices to mitigate these kinds of risks that we've identified. Now, it's not a very complicated recommendation to say, just follow the law and inspect them every year. So that was one of our recommendations. But we made a series of other recommendations which to establish the kind of procedures to make sure that the management of this division would know if there were shortcomings in those annual inspections. Incidentally, the other key part of that was trying to determine what the department was doing when they found life safety concerns and whether they were requiring those things, those deficiencies, to be corrected quickly. And the answer there was that we were finding that was not always the case. So I'll maybe to tie the bow on this one, because you also mentioned we can't compel an agency to do anything. So we make the recommendations. Most departments respond by saying, thank you for taking this independent look, and we're going to do our best to address all of the things you recommended to us. But then we don't go away. We do 2 follow-ups with a little bit of time elapsing to make sure that they've actually adopted our recommendations. So if we issue a report today, we will come back 1 year from now and we will look to see, have they actually implemented the recommendations we made? And that requires the same type of documentation that our auditors looked for in the first place. They can't just say, oh yeah, we did it, don't look here anymore, we're good. They have to show us that they've actually implemented the recommendations. We do the same thing 3 years out because we know that some recommendations might take time to implement. So this is not meant to be a punitive type of process. It's meant to give them the time they need to adopt the recommendations that we've identified. And we generally have very, very high compliance with the recommendations we make. But that is
go ahead.
You use the word collaborative, and I'm not sure that every auditee thinks of it as a collaborative process, although we hope it's a collegial process.
Collegial, right.
But when they adopt our recommendations, that is a sign that they agree that we've presented just the facts and that there are opportunities to improve. And so the alternative, if they did not adopt our recommendations, you might ask, well, what can we do about it? And we really only have some simple levers at our disposal. We could go to the governor's office and say, we're not sure you're aware that one of your departments is refusing to improve their practices, and hope that with that executive level of intervention, there may be some positive improvements. We can go to the legislature and say, we know this is a key concern for you, and we just want you to know we identified these 1, 2, 3 recommendations, and the department is not stepping up and doing them, and you can do with that what you will. We could theoretically go to the public and the press and say, we just want to alert you because we serve you, the public, that we identified these things and the particular branch of government hasn't stepped up to address it. But when we do that, we also have to be careful about how we do that. We do not want to compromise the objectivity that is critical to this whole process. This whole endeavor of the auditor's office relies on people believing that all we care about is the facts and compliance with the law, and compliance with program rules, and so on.
But that actually does give the entity that's audited, or the division, or whatever is being audited, the opportunity for remediation. And that's very important as well. So they may not agree with your findings, and they can come back and say, we do agree with the outcome of your findings, but we believe this is the better process to get there. So you are not enforcing your what your findings are. You're not telling them you must do it this way. You are not their internal control management.
Correct.
And that distinction is very important for the people to understand. So the fact that you are alerting them to your fact find, and it's not just, gee, I had a cup of coffee today and I'm going to go sniffing around. These are facts that, you look for evidence.
Yes.
You have to have a materiality level. You have to go in there and you have to say, we have enough information that makes it reliable for us to support our findings.
That's exactly right. Sufficient and appropriate evidence is the term.
I know. I was going to stay away from those words. But you hit it. That's exactly right. So also, before we go a little bit deeper into some of this, you also get to do investigative reporting.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because, that always piques people's, attention, investigative reporters.
Yeah, the audit world has sometimes rather cryptic language. And so the sort of governing Bible of the government auditing community, GAGAS, the generally accepted government auditing standards, it refers to audits, and when something's not an audit, as a non-audit. So this is, not a particularly helpful way to describe to the general public what something that isn't an audit looks like. So in our office, in an attempt to have a slightly more useful moniker, we use the term investigative reports. Now, some people think, oh, we're operating almost like law enforcement. That's not what is meant by investigative reports. It means that we're doing kind of an accountability investigation that is guided by the facts, guided by the same spirit of objectivity and independence as one of our formal performance audits, but doesn't have to follow or adhere to the same level of documentary backup, if you will, that one of our performance audits does. It allows us to
Yeah, the
move.
procedures are not as defined, and you use the words that there has to be different rules in the accounting, and you're right. I call them more. Accounting is so definitive. We have like a mindset in accounting, which what makes it work.
Yeah.
I mean, our definitions are like the, legal community has their definitions. And when we say something, we interpret it entirely different. Like we are on the stand as an expert, you're going to give your expert definition and judge may scratch his head, or her head, but they're going to accept it.
Right.
And so these are test functions regardless. You're issuing a report, but the requirements to get there in your non-audit is more forensic scope.
That's right. We're digging in a slightly different way, and while they don't adhere to the same set of procedures as one of our formal performance audits, we have our own governing Bible called our Professional Standards Manual, and that lays out all of the very detailed procedures that our investigative reports must follow. So these are often, we're able to move a little more quickly and respond to what I would call more emergent issues, something that might require a work product in a shorter time frame than one of our performance audits typically takes. And some of the ones we've done in recent years have been quite, I think, interesting and important. One of the first when I got into the office was around the state employee health care plan. And like many other states, Vermont's state employee health plan has been increasing by leaps and bounds, almost entirely driven by increases in healthcare prices, not so much in the utilization of healthcare by the state employees. And so, sensing that this is a real pressure point for the state budget, we tried to explore how other states have gone about trying to manage that expense, and found a few examples, not many, of states that have tried to be more aggressive in managing those costs. And one of the most illuminating that we found was the state of Montana, which had adopted something called reference-based pricing, which I will not bore people to tears with the specifics of it, other than to say that they tried to basically be more aggressive in negotiating lower prices paid for the healthcare that they were receiving for the state employees. And in Montana, which had a split political balance, they had a Democratic governor at the time and a Republican legislature. It was the resolution to an impasse about how to pay for the state employee health plan. So we put forward, we didn't say legislature and governor do this. We said, here's an option for you to consider. Here's what the experience was in another state. And if you want to pursue it further, you should bring in some experts who understand the details of how you would manage this. And now it has now been several years, but one of the key elements in the most recent healthcare legislation that the legislature passed and the governor signed, I think enthusiastically on both sides, was just that, a reference-based pricing directive for the Green Mountain Care Board, who oversee the state's healthcare system, to find a way to unveil this concept. So I'm not saying because our office did this report, it led to that, but it certainly helped inform that process, and I think was really key. A second one, I think everyone in Vermont, especially in the population centers in each county, are more than familiar with the increase in homelessness and mental health challenges and addiction challenges that are features, unfortunately, of so much of our unhoused population, the people who are truly on the streets. And we did basically a full accounting of how much money had been spent by the state to address homelessness over the course of, I believe it was 6 years. And this was a period from, I think, 2017 to about 2021 or two. I can't remember the specifics off the top of my head. And it was just eye-popping. It was, almost $500 million in just 5 or 6 years. And that was before the spike that we saw in the post-COVID years. Mm-hmm. So it didn't say, state, do the following to address homelessness. What it said is, this has become an extremely costly and growing expense for state taxpayers. And if policymakers between the executive and legislative branches do not find a resolution, this is going to continue to be a huge drain on state resources, not to mention the human toll that it takes with
this is very important, Tim, and I read the reports that come out of this department. Kind of tells you how exciting my life is, right? But how do the people get these reports? See, we understand how the legislators have access. We understand how the state has access, regardless of whether they delve into them or not. Yeah. How do the people find these reports?
Well, we have two straightforward mechanisms. The first is we have a fairly large email list that we send out. Typically, we use sparingly because we know people are tired of receiving too much. But whenever we release a new report, whether it's a full audit or one of these investigative reports, we send that out. Now, that gets to only the people that are on that list, and right. Maybe some forward it on, but we can't imagine that's a huge number. But we send that out to many thousands of people. We also generally find that the media is interested in our work, which is great, because they can amplify it beyond our direct ability to communicate to people. So we always communicate with the media when we release a report. We try to put our work in plain English so that it does not make people who are listening to it, if they're driving, drive off the road because they, fall asleep listening to it. So those are kind of the two big ways, but it's an admittedly difficult challenge, especially as the media landscape has changed so much. So if WCAX or WPTZ or Vermont Digger or 7 Days, if they put something out, we know that's getting to a very large audience. But we also know that people's information habits have changed so much. So we do our best to be proactive. We don't just say, we spent 9 months working on this audit, we put out one press release and move on. We try to keep communicating over and over again, even if it's repeating some of the message from previous alerts we've sent out. But it's the great challenge. I think when people learn about the work we do, they're always more fascinated than they thought they would be, because I think most people appreciate that, especially in these days, that there's an office trying to make sure that you can count on somebody holding government accountable that isn't a polarizing force. I think people really value that. And I think they also value that what we're saying is Vermonters deserve excellence in government services. And they're lucky to have so many conscientious state employees who are helping deliver as best they can or as best they know how. But they're happy to know someone is out there keeping an eye on them to make sure that if there's room for improvement, that the opportunity for that improvement won't be missed. So it's
right. So
tough. It's tough though to get out the word out as much as we'd like.
But these reports are on the site, correct?
Oh yeah. If you go to our website, you'll see every report that dates back to previous state auditors, probably going back almost 15 or 20 years, I'd say. And if you look at the performance audits, you'll see that first category of deep dives. And then if you go to the investigative reports, you'll see a whole bunch of smaller projects, but are on much more targeted emergent issues. And there is one other, you asked earlier how we make our decisions about what audits we will do. And this is, I would say, on the smaller end of the use of our time, but the governor under statute is authorized to ask us to do an audit. I can only recall one such instance that's overlapped with my 4.5 years in the office. And you may recall that a number of years ago, it might have been 2021, 2021, sorry, the Department of Labor accidentally sent out 1099s with other people's information. So I would receive one with your social security number, and which is, a huge problem. So the
Thank
governor
you for
asked,
paying my tax bill.
yeah, right. So if your tax bill wasn't paid, it's because I didn't pay it.
That's right.
But the governor asked our office to take responsibility for doing an audit to figure out what happened. And that was because, I think very wisely, he did not want his own people to be responsible for that inquiry for fear that it would look biased and that they might not be providing the level of scrutiny or skepticism that the issue really
Or
demanded.
giving accurate information. I mean,
Yeah.
they may not know. I mean,
right.
they just might not know who hit the send button, right? So
Exactly.
and
So
that's where you all come in.
So that can happen, but almost never does, in truth. The legislature theoretically can direct us in statute to do certain things. They have been sparing in doing so. The one exception is tax increment financing districts, of which Newport.
I was salivating to get there, right?
Yeah, in our house, there's a rule you can't talk about tax increment financing after 10 p.m. Because it's just not healthy. But back Newport, Winooski, Burlington, and Milton were the first TIF districts, that's the term, dating back 15 plus years ago or more, 20 plus years ago. And Auditor Hoffer's predecessor, Tom Salmon, when he was in office, did the first performance audits of those 4 communities, TIF districts. And those audits found that there had been substantial problems in the financial management of those districts. And the reason why, your listeners should care is because that typically means that the communities are underpaying the education fund, which means that property taxes for everyone else are higher than they needed to be. So because some of these financial management problems had been persisting for many years without anyone from the state taking a look, it meant the severity of them was much greater. It was like the problems kept compounding year after year after year. To avoid that happening again, the legislature put in statute that these TIF districts had to be audited several times each by the auditor's office. So it was a moment in time trying to clean up a messy situation and make sure it didn't repeat. So if you go to our list of performance audits, there will be a disproportionate number of TIF audits, and people might say, why is the auditor's office prioritizing that when what we care about is the environment or healthcare costs or public safety? And our response would be, we care about all those things too, but the state law requires us to do those TIF districts. And so that has at times occupied almost a quarter of the staff resources in our office, which is a considerable demand on our office. And
let's talk about that, because it is. I mean, it's a lot of resources, but it is a law, and a good law, in my opinion, regardless, because of what your findings have shown. And this doesn't mean it's like, oh, the auditors department hate TIFs. No. This is the findings. And now it's like, let's figure it out and fix it. But the cost of the audits that come actually do get billed back to the TIF municipality, right? Is that correct? And I know there's been some, naysayers who go, no, let's change this. But right now, the residents should be aware that is a cost. That's part of the TIF. It is what it is. And I don't believe that they're aware of that. I think that they need to be more aware.
I think you're right. What we do is important. And when we find that a district has been mismanaged, what we're primarily saying is we are looking out for state property taxpayers who will suffer the consequences of mismanagement at the local level. And when I say mismanagement, it doesn't mean someone is willfully breaking the law, or
Right.
it means
Right.
they just haven't got it right. And as a result, it's had consequences for other people. And sometimes when we release those reports, the municipal officials will complain because they'll say, we think we did everything right. How can you possibly say this? Or they'll say, the auditor doesn't like TIFs. And it's like, that's not what this is about. We were required by law to do these. We have a team of absolutely nonpartisan, objective auditors who go in and look at the facts. And when they present the facts, sometimes people don't like them, but that's
right.
But that's the way it is. And
I mean, you're the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. Right?
Exactly.
I mean, it is
Exactly.
what it is.
And we've when we speak to the legislature about these districts, what we often have to tell them is that voters who are voters have to vote to approve these particular types of tax districts, and municipal officials are often very optimistic about how successful this local development is going to go, and sometimes it works out great, but there's risk involved even to the local taxpayers if if a set of buildings that is supposed to happen as a part of one of these special tax arrangements, if they don't pan out the way people had planned, it is local taxpayers who are supposed to bear the burden of paying extra money to the state to pick up the slack. And you very rarely hear local communities saying to the voters before these votes that there's risk. It's almost always presented in sort of general terms as essentially no risk. But that's a desire, that's a wish, but that isn't necessarily true that there's no risk. There is risk involved, and sometimes
there's a lot of risk.
Yes.
A lot of risk. Doesn't mean that it can't be a successful TIF district.
That's correct.
But there is a lot of risk, and the taxpayers who will bear the burden at the end of the day, particularly if it doesn't pan out and the debt's owed by the municipalities, the taxpayers have to come up with that money.
That's right.
And we'll get into the VEPC issue and then, later. But right now, I mean, the bottom line is you're doing what you're supposed to do by law.
That's right.
And we've had some, for example, I believe you found in St. Albans. I mean, they went in there and you identified that monies were used for different projects that were not approved by VEPC. They were used for their Ace hardware project. And that's where I come back to, you're not in charge of doing enforcement. So you did some findings, but it's not your job to go in there and say, nasty, nasty little St. Albans, you have to do this, right? It's you made the public aware of these issues. Then it falls back on VEPC or the state attorney or the legislature or the state, whoever's involved in finding these fixes. If there can be a remedy, sometimes there can't be a remedy. And then I would think it would drive down to the municipality themselves and the taxpayers to take action. But the key right there is you are the fact finders.
That's right. And where there's sometimes wrinkles is where there are gray areas. These are not unlike some other programs run by state government. There's complexity involved, and especially as the world gets more and more complicated, it's not always possible to anticipate every single eventuality. And so from time to time, our office has to seek advice from other parties to tell us, what did you mean by this? How did you want St. Albans to implement this particular development activity? And that where there's gray area, which is unavoidable in state law, it means that there's going to be some tension, and tension is not a bad thing. It just makes the task a little bit more difficult.
But if there is a gray area, as we know in the law, there's a gray area. That's why we get to have all different lawyers all over the place, right? Come on in and, who has the best defense wins, right? But the key right there is you're establishing, the state laws, and you are coming up with precedents, and you're coming up with case law, which is the foundation. And that will help the legislators go in and adjust the
That's right.
laws. So being the catalyst as the auditor is vital to the state's well-being.
Oh, for,
I mean,
for,
I
for
believe
sure.
that.
For sure. And, and some of it, I think, as I said, Vermont's lucky to have a, a very high quality workforce in state government who are truly conscientious. And I think that the mission behind each department really seeps through. And I think most employees really strive to fulfill the mission of their particular program or department. I think that's great. And so when we have findings and make recommendations, it is always meant to improve things, not to just to criticize or make someone feel bad or denigrate. When we do see our recommendations adopted when there's been gray areas, sometimes it's really powerful and in simple ways even. So our project around large IT projects is a good example. So any Vermonter can go on the Agency of Digital Services, ADS, go to their website, and there is a one-stop shopping sort of dashboard that shows all of the major IT projects that the state of Vermont is currently working on. And the list might have 30 or 40 projects ranging from a few $100,000 to a few $100 million.
Okay.
What we found was that in the way they were presenting this to the legislature and to taxpayers, they were saying they would use this sort of color coding system to describe whether the project was going well or if it was running into problems. They would have a red, a yellow, and a green. So I think people can know which ones are meant to be positive, green, negative would be red. But what we found was that the way they were presenting the information kept moving the goalposts and changing the starting line. Or maybe I'm mixing sports metaphors there, but they're moving the finish line and the starting line at different times, but not communicating that to people in a way that was very forthcoming. So let's say a project was supposed to cost $10 million and take 1 year. If 13 months later, so that now 1 month late by most people's reckoning, that project was only 50% done and now was going to cost $20 million. They would basically restate the project's expected cost and time and say that the project was estimated to be $20 million and be done in 2 years. And they would have a green indicator suggesting that the project was going great.
Isn't that an interesting concept?
Because what they were doing was saying, we've reassessed where things stand and the new cost and the new schedule is X. So within that new construct, the new time frame, the new cost, things are going okay. But if you're the taxpayer or the legislator, you're saying, wait a sec, but how would I know that this thing has gone totally off the rails, that it's doubled in cost and it's doubled in the amount of time it's going to take? So we went to the legislature and said, look, we're here just to have integrity in that communication process and make these very straightforward suggestions. And we were so pleased that they quickly realized that it was in their own interest as policymakers and people who passed the budget to know what's really going on with these projects. Not because they were saying that somebody had screwed up necessarily, but that they couldn't make informed decisions if the information was so obscure or frequently modified without really communicating to people what was going on.
And that communication and transparency is where I personally get nervous, say like on TIFs and now the new chip coming out with the miscommunication and just, you get in an exuberant municipality leader who give me a TIF and it'll make it a miracle, and then it's not fair to the taxpayers. Not that TIFs aren't good. I mean, but, you have to also look at the history of the city. You have to see who's in there. I mean, some of your findings found that there were errors with the NEMRIC accounting system. There were mismanagement of the funds. And like you're saying, not with intentional mismanagement, but, local, towns and cities will tend to have cash flow issues until their taxes things come in. So they'll go, we'll borrow from Peter to pay Paul. Well, you can't do that. Okay. And as I said, being the catalyst from your office is so important. I mean, when I was in as the mayor of Newport, I found that they didn't even have the asset, a school that they owned on their balance sheet. And that's mind blowing.
Those kinds of examples, when taxpayers hear about it, they often roll their eyes and say, "Oh, that's government," But the truth is that it's I don't know. The term continuous improvement is like management speak, but really that's what government is always about. In theory, is about trying to make things better and better and better. And you found that in your role as the mayor, based on your skill set, which were helpful to identify that, and then you can make the change. A similar example, we are doing an audit right now of the Department of Buildings and General Services to see how they manage the energy consumption in state buildings, which statute calls on them to be very aggressive to try to reduce the expense associated with that, both for financial and climate reasons. And they produce a book each year, which is called the Space Book, not like outer space, but it's the facilities that are owned and managed by state government. And we started looking through it and said, where's the Department of Labor building in Montpelier? Where's the Department of Labor building? So this is a document that's been used by legislators for probably 20 years, and it actually was not complete. So we found it odd, but then we quickly communicated, you've got problems here. Like, this is not the total story. You got to redouble your efforts to get every single property in this book. Now, that wasn't the focus of our audit, but it's one of those things that,
With finding.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what happens with audits. You come up with findings. I mean, it's not rabbit holes. I mean, this is just, oops, let's fix it. And the recommendations. But what I'm hearing here is like, now we have the new chip coming out, which is going to be interesting. And correct me again if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that chip is without the but for. And so it's like the TIF without the but for, plus a lot of changes that is going to be new, and it's going to be interesting to see how that happens. And, I'm sure there's going to be a jump on the bandwagon to people say, okay, this is easier for us to get some money, but transparency to the taxpayers is crucial here, to understanding that if that money's not paid back, guess who's paying it back?
Yeah, for people who aren't familiar, it's the CHIP program was the legislature and governor's attempt to create a way to fund infrastructure at the local level, which would, in theory, then prompt private development of housing in particular.
Right.
And it's a good example of where our office is, in a tense spot, because it's not for us to say, do the CHIP program, don't do the CHIP program. That's a policy judgment that is made by the people who are the policymakers. What we do is say, if you're going to go forward, be aware of the following risks inherent in what you're proposing. We will look at the particular details that have been laid out and say, we've evaluated this and we have the following concerns, A, B, and C. And so we often have to kind of caveat it and say, look, we know there's a housing issue. We know there's a municipal infrastructure issue. We are not here talking about whether those things need more investment. We are here saying that this is the program that you're proposing to vote on, and we've identified real issues that may come back to haunt you if you don't think about it now. And you want to think about it now, not 10 years from now when you see the results and don't like them. So the CHIP program, you mentioned the but for, and I'll keep it simple, but generally speaking, the state's economic development interventions are meant to be done in the belief that they wouldn't happen without taxpayer money, right? The private sector does the private sector's work, and the government really isn't supposed to be fundamentally altering what goes on in the private sector. And so the idea is that the government gets involved to help make things happen that wouldn't happen anyways. They wouldn't happen but for the state's tax money coming to bear. And so most previous programs have required the applicant for this taxpayer money to basically affirm that they would not do the project, or it would be far lesser of a project, but for the use of these public investment dollars. And as you say, the CHIP program, which is a potentially massive scale across the state, municipalities all over the state have the opportunity to participate in this in new ways, does not always require any assertion that the project needed the taxpayer money. So some projects will just be eligible. So one of the things we pointed out was that this runs the risk of literally just being a transfer of taxpayer money from most taxpayers to some developers. We weren't saying developers are bad people, that development is bad, but just that if you don't require them to demonstrate they actually need the money, you may be just handing money to someone who doesn't need it. And that, we put that before the legislature. They made some adjustments to their program, not all of what we suggested, but I think they acknowledged that that is a risk. The second was, this is a program that is meant to spur housing construction. When we first reviewed the proposal, I believe we were probably the first to identify the fact that, as written, some of the projects could actually feature relatively little housing and a tremendous amount of commercial activity. And so we said, legislature, if this is a housing program at its core, you need to make some adjustments to make sure that projects that come through and are approved are actually producing housing, which seemed like a not particularly radical statement, but we had the ability to sit calmly and look at the material, whereas we understand legislators are in a more cacophonous debate setting, and it's not always as easy to zero in on these kinds of concerns. Affordability was a key thing that we pointed out, that there are some who believe that the government should be putting money into housing regardless of the price point of the housing that's being created. Our position wasn't to say whether that's a wise or foolish policy choice, but we said, legislators, we are hearing you say you want housing affordable to people who don't have a lot of resources and who have been priced out of the rental and home ownership markets. If you want the construction to be pushed in the direction of those Vermonters, then you have to include some guardrails to make sure that that's where the investment is going to go. So that's the kind of interaction that we sometimes have with the legislature. It's not always terrifically comfortable, because many legislators are saying, I want more housing in my community, like whatever it takes. And we say that people have the right to their approach and their opinion, but it's not a question of whether there should be more housing. It's how it should be managed and delivered.
That's right. And the cost factor.
That's right.
So this has been fantastic. I want to thank you so much for being on the show with me today. And I also want you to give me a commitment right now that you will come back. Yeah. So is there anything you'd like to say before we depart?
I think if people check out our website, it'll help you really understand this kind of breadth of issues that we look at. And frankly, people should contact us directly if they have particular programs or areas of state government where they're scratching their heads and wondering if anyone's taken a look at it in a while. I feel like many of the best insights we get come from a single Vermonter who says, I've always wondered about this program. And then we sort of get interested ourselves and we start taking a look. And sometimes we say, you know what, we don't think that there's any there. We think that things look okay. But then that is a good thing too, confirming that things are being done well, sometimes even with a more cursory review. That's not a bad thing either. So we always welcome suggestions from people. It doesn't mean we can do an audit just because someone contacts us, but we love to hear that kind of input from people, especially out on the ground in the communities.
Well, thank you. So this has been Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan, with our featured guest today, Deputy Auditor Tim Ashe. And I thank you so much, and thank you, NEK-TV. So we look forward to seeing you next show too. Bye.